My name is Emily Marcellus, and the title of my presentation is the Special Education Referral and Evaluation Process for English Language Learners. The research question that I was investigating is, what are the challenges inherent in the special education referral and evaluation process for English language learners, and what are some of the potential solutions to these challenges? The problem of representation. So the level of disproportionality differs depending on the level of analysis. For example, if we look at district, state, or national data, the amount of disproportionality will differ. So at the national level, only African Americans and intellectual disabilities and emotional disturbance and Native Americans and learning disabilities are overrepresented in special education. However, if you look at the state or the local data, it can look very different. So I'm going to look at the case of a district in California. In this specific district, English language learners were overrepresented at the secondary level, but they were actually underrepresented at the elementary level. So in this district, English language learners with limited L1 and L2, so limited abilities in their native language and English, were overrepresented in learning disabilities in both elementary and secondary levels. In addition, these students were also overrepresented by 23.8 percentage points in intellectual disabilities at the secondary level. So let's look at some of the challenges inherent in the referral process. So one challenge is that pre-referral strategies are often implemented sporadically or with little effect. And this is something that was a big theme in multiple articles I looked at, that these strategies that are recommended aren't really being implemented with fidelity. A second referral challenge is that we have a tendency to concentrate on problems from a within-child perspective. So we assume that the problems we're seeing in the classroom with the child are their own problem, their own fault, instead of looking at whether we have a culturally responsive curriculum and instruction, whether our classroom is supportive for that child. There's also the problem of a self-fulfilling prophecy of educators. So if teachers already have the view that these students can't learn or won't learn, then it's self-fulfilling. They won't. So in that way, the educator's own beliefs are affecting their students' performance. And finally, this is kind of tied into the last point, school personnel tend to ignore the exclusionary clause of opportunity to learn. So for students to be diagnosed with a learning disability, we need to exclude that students didn't have an opportunity to learn. And opportunity to learn for English language learners would include a classroom that is responsive to their specific needs. Now we're going to look at some challenges inherent in the evaluation process for special education. One challenge is that there is no test of language proficiency that can adequately determine when a child with a primary language other than English is ready to be tested only in English. So a student's fluency in English in their oral language skills can sometimes mask the need for a native language assessment. For example, a study by Ochoa, Rivera, and Powell, which is cited in Klinger and Harry, surveyed 859 school psychologists who had some experience conducting bilingual assessments and found that only 6% of the psychologists reported asking for the student's home language, and that just 1% attempted to determine if a discrepancy occurred in both English and the student's home language. In addition, there's also an over-reliance on IQ test scores. These tests are based on norms for monolingual students, so either students that are fluent and their first language is English, or students that are fluent and their first language is Spanish or any other language. So this really calls into question the validity of using these assessments for students that are English language learners or bilingual. In addition, in a study by Izquierdo, Blalock, and Torres Velazquez, only half of students with bilingual linguistic or cultural differences took cognitive tests in their native language. But even if they are given these tests in their native language, these bilingual assessments are rarely included in reports. In addition, there's also unintentional bias in testing. This can be content bias, so content students are unfamiliar with, unfamiliarity with test-taking behaviors, differential interpretation of questions, and lack of familiarity with vocabulary. And all of these issues can impact the student's performance on these assessments. Finally, familiarity with standard English accounts for more than 50% of the total test variance on IQ and achievement test measures for 4th graders, and upwards of 60 to 90% of the variance for 7th graders. So let's look at some solutions for referral and evaluation. So one solution is to use culturally and linguistically responsive pre-referral interventions. And Garcia and Ortiz gave us an outline of what this should look like. So one aspect of this is preventing school underachievement and failure. So there should be a shared responsibility among educators for the education of all students. There should be a culturally responsive curricula and instruction, and availability of a range of general education service and programs, collaborative relationships with culturally and linguistically diverse families, and ongoing professional development. Secondly, there's a great need for early intervention in struggling learners because all too often pre-referral activities are viewed as a hurdle before students can be tested for special education, and sometimes pre-referral is really activated too late. Thirdly, diagnostic and prescriptive teaching. And this looks like teaching skills, subject, or concepts, and then reteaching using significantly different strategies or approaches for the benefit of students who fail to meet expected performance levels. And then to use informal assessment strategies to identify student strengths and weaknesses and the possible causes of academic and or behavioral difficulties. In addition, there's a need to use curriculum-based assessments to monitor student progress. Finally, and I started this one 3 times because it was a recommendation I found in several articles, is the availability of general education problem-solving support teams. So this would look like peer and or expert consultation and the creation of a teacher assistance team so that teachers can request assistance. They're not referring a student, but they're referring themselves because they need further assistance. And so that kind of allows teachers to continue to own the problem and not put that problem on the student yet. The second potential referral and evaluation solution is to consider outside child factors. So looking at the curriculum, looking at the specific classroom the student's in, looking at the strategies that the teacher has used for that child, looking at the school culture and seeing if any of these factors would have an impact on that child's performance. In addition, there's a recommendation for professional development, and the areas that this is recommended in is the exclusionary clause, factors of opportunity to learn, how to meaningfully implement pre-referral strategies, second language acquisition, cognitive development, and how to communicate and interact with parents. In addition, one article recommended the use of pre-service training for pre-service teachers in second language acquisition. So some of the things that they would learn would be the characteristics of students receiving special education services who are ELLs, federal and state guidelines, the foundations of second language acquisition, ELD instructional practices, formal and informal assessments, successful instructional approaches. So all of these would be integrated into pre-service training for teachers. In addition, a study recommended the use of RTII referral model rather than the discrepancy model, which is based on testing. And this should theoretically erase the issue of testing bias or anything like that. Also, another solution is to include an individual familiar with second language acquisition in all meetings, in the pre-referral meetings, child study teams, and IEP meetings. And finally, there's a suggestion to use multiple assessments to determine students' linguistic abilities, so we get a whole picture of what the student is capable of. Implications for professional practice. So on this page, I have listed some things that we need to do in the future. One thing we need to do is take pre-referral strategies more seriously. As a special education teacher, I have had a lot of teachers come up to me and ask when we can move forward, when we can stop these strategies and move on to testing. And maybe I need to provide more support to these teachers in how they implement their strategies. In addition, we need to look at factors outside of the student. And I am definitely guilty of this, taking a lot based on the testing data that I see and making a lot of assumptions based on that. However, I can definitely see the value in doing classroom observations. For example, the school psychologist at the school I worked with did do a classroom observation for one of my students, and she said that she could not identify any classroom management system for this student. And now that I understand that, I can see why there were behavior problems present in the classroom. So this was not a supportive classroom environment for him, and maybe that should be looked at as a factor instead of within child problems. In addition, we need to create assessments that are normed to bilingual students so that we can use assessments that are valid for the population that we're trying to assess. We also need to provide support for teachers through teacher support programs, and I think it would be really interesting to start one of these at the school I work with. Starting a program where teachers can refer themselves for when they need additional support, when they're having difficulty in the classroom, and having a group of teachers that can bounce ideas off of them. I think this would be really beneficial for the school at large. In addition, I think there's a need to provide more home language support. Students in immersion or submersion programs were much more likely to be placed in special education programs than those in bilingual programs. So that shows me that if we provide more home language support in the classroom, then we can hopefully try to prevent those unnecessary referrals. And here are my references.